At some point in your life, someone sat you down and explained contraception. Maybe it was a parent. Maybe it was a health class. Maybe it was a very awkward conversation that you have spent years trying to forget. But here's the part nobody ever told you. Humans have been trying to solve this exact problem for at least 4,000 years, possibly longer. And the methods they came up with, the actual, documented, historically verified methods, range from genuinely brilliant to absolutely unhinged. Some of them worked. Some of them were catastrophically wrong in ways that are almost funny from a safe distance. And at least one of them is so sophisticated that modern scientists spent decades trying to figure out how ancient people discovered it. Without a laboratory, a microscope, or any understanding of how reproduction actually worked at a cellular level. They figured it out anyway. This is the history nobody teaches in health class. Let's start in ancient Egypt, because Egypt is where most of the oldest written evidence lives, and the Egyptians, it turns out, were thinking about this with the same energy they brought to pyramids. The Kahun gynecological papyrus dates to approximately 1825 BC. That is not a typo. 1825 BC. It is one of the oldest medical documents ever found, and a significant portion of it is dedicated entirely to contraception. The recipes cited are, let's say, creative. One of the most common recommendations was a pessary made from crocodile dung mixed with fermented dough, inserted before intercourse. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Crocodile dung. Fermented dough. This is not a punishment. This was the medical advice of a civilization that built structures we still can't fully explain. Here is the thing, though. Crocodile dung is alkaline. Alkaline environments are hostile to sperm. The fermented dough created acidity. The combination, accidentally probably, created a pH environment that was genuinely spermicidal. It was not clean, it was not pleasant, but it was not entirely wrong either. The Egyptians also used honey and acacia tips in similar preparations. Acacia ferments into lactic acid, which is, still to this day, a recognized spermicidal compound. Modern contraceptive jellies have used it. They didn't know why it worked. They knew that it did, and they wrote it down. Now let's go to ancient Greece, because the Greeks took this seriously in a different way, philosophically, medically, and with a level of specificity that frankly raises questions about how they gathered the data. Cyrannus of Ephesus was a Greek physician practicing in Rome around the 2nd AD. He wrote a text called Gynecology. It still exists, you can read it. And he was remarkably systematic about contraception. He distinguished between contraceptives and abortifacients. He ranked methods by effectiveness. He acknowledged that some approaches worked better than others. His recommended contraceptives included cedar resin, white lead ointments, and olive oil applied before intercourse. Oil-based barriers. Right, he was describing something that functions, mechanically, as a kind of block. Modern science confirms that oil creates an environment that disrupts sperm motility. He didn't have a word for sperm motility. He had 400 years of clinical observation. He also recommended that women hold their breath and sneeze immediately after intercourse. We're going to move past that one. The point is, Cyrannus was not a folk healer muttering in a cave. He was a trained physician writing a systematic medical text, and he was already operating on the premise, 2,000 years ago, that pregnancy prevention was a legitimate medical subject worth serious intellectual effort. But here's where the story gets genuinely strange. There is a plant called silphium. It grew in a narrow coastal region near the ancient Greek colony of Cyrene, in what is now Libya. It looked roughly like giant fennel. It had a distinctive heart-shaped seed pod, and it was, by the accounts of ancient writers from Aristotle to Pliny the Elder, one of the most valuable substances in the ancient Mediterranean world. Cyrene built its entire economy on it. The city appeared on its coins. It was traded for its weight in silver. Julius Caesar, when he seized the Roman treasury, reportedly found a massive stockpile of it. What was it used for? Flavoring food, yes. Medicine, yes. But the primary use, the one that commanded silver-equivalent pricing across the entire ancient world, was contraception and menstrual regulation. Ancient writers were explicit about this. Soranus recommended it. So did others. It was described as taken orally, once a month, in a dose the size of a chickpea, and it apparently worked well enough that the entire Mediterranean was willing to pay extraordinary prices for it for centuries. And then, around the 1st century AD, Silphium went extinct. Completely. Totally. No surviving specimens. The last recorded plant was reportedly sent to Emperor Nero as a curiosity. Gone. This means we cannot test it, we cannot analyze it, we cannot know with certainty what compound it contained or exactly what it did biologically. But here is what we do know. Its closest surviving relatives, plants in the same genus, Ferula species, have been studied by modern researchers. Several of them contain compounds that demonstrably interfere with implantation and early pregnancy in animal studies. Queen Anne's lace, also known as wild carrot, is in the same botanical family. Women in rural Appalachia were using it as a contraceptive well into the 20th century, completely independently of ancient Mediterranean practice. Modern researchers tested it. The seeds inhibit progesterone synthesis in rats. It has measurable biological activity that is consistent with what ancient users described. Silphium may have been the most effective plant-based contraceptive in human history, and we ate it into extinction. Let's go east. Ancient Chinese medical texts from around 200 BC describe women drinking mercury to prevent pregnancy. This worked, in the loosest possible sense of the word, because mercury is profoundly toxic and would destroy the pregnancy along with a significant portion of everything else. This is the category of ancient contraception we're going to call technically effective, catastrophically inadvisable. It was not the only one. Ancient Greek and Roman texts also describe drinking preparations containing lead. Lead was used in wine production, in cookware, in cosmetics, and medicine. The Roman upper class was consuming lead constantly, and nobody connected it to the widespread infertility and cognitive decline that Roman historians were separately documenting in incredible detail. There's a theory, not universally accepted, but taken seriously by a number of historians, that chronic lead poisoning significantly reduced fertility in the Roman upper class for centuries, not intentionally, as a side effect of a lifestyle so saturated in lead that the contraception was accidental and the poisoning was just Tuesday. History's most unintentional birth control program, running for 300 years. Here's what I want you to notice about all of this. Every single culture, every continent, every era of recorded human history, they were all working on the same problem, simultaneously, independently, with whatever they had. The Mesopotamians had their methods. The Indians described contraceptive preparations in the Kama Sutra. Yes, that Kama Sutra, which is largely a text about a great many things that are not what most people think it is. Ancient Hawaiians, ancient sub-Saharan Africans, indigenous populations across the Americas. All of them documented, in their own medical and cultural traditions, systematic attempts to control reproduction. This tells you something important. The desire to separate sex from reproduction is not a modern invention. It is not a product of the sexual revolution, or feminism, or pharmaceutical companies, or moral decay, or any other narrative people reach for when this subject makes them uncomfortable. It is as old as civilization, possibly older, because we only have written evidence going back about 4,000 years. Humans have been behaviorally modern for at least 200,000. The 4,000 years of documentation is almost certainly not the beginning of the practice. It is just the beginning of the paper trail. Now, let's talk about the ones that actually worked mechanically, because not all ancient contraception was herbal chemistry. The condom has a longer history than most people realize. Cave paintings in France, dated to approximately 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, depict what some researchers interpret as covered phalluses. The interpretation is contested, but physical barrier methods show up clearly in the historical record long before the modern era. Ancient Egyptians used linen sheaths. There is debate as to whether these were primarily contraceptive or protective against disease. Probably both. Gabriele Falloppio, yes, the same man who described the fallopian tubes, published a treatise in 1564 describing a linen sheath soaked in a chemical solution as protection against syphilis. He reportedly tested it on 1,100 men. All of them, he claimed, remained disease-free. The modern condom, as we know it, made of vulcanized rubber, dates to the 1850s, about 15 years after Charles Goodyear figured out rubber vulcanization. Before that, condoms were made from animal intestine. Primarily sheep's cecum, if you were wondering, which you probably weren't, but now you know, and you're welcome. They were expensive. They were reused. They were sometimes advertised in 18th century London newspapers under the name Mrs. Phillips Wares, with a level of euphemism so elaborate it almost wraps back around to being direct.